Hello, ladies and gents. On Infants Youth today, young adults, young teenagers, adults, IPs. It's broaden your horizon. We're on module A225 Block 3, Decline and Renewal 1880 to 1914, edited by Mackie, page 134. Unit 18, Urbanisation, Degeneration, Understanding of the Big City. As you'll discover in section 18.4, new forms of social investigation in the 1880s would provide a more complex and nuanced picture of poverty in London. But this basic understanding of the capital would persist. Writing in 1901, for instance, the novelist and historian Walter Besant, 1836 to 1901, East London as a distinct city in its own right, but one that was significantly impoverished. The population is greater than that of Berlin or Vienna, or St. Petersburg or Philadelphia. In the streets, there are never seen any private carriages. There is no fashionable quarter. One meets no ladies in the principal thoroughfares. People, shops, houses, conveyances altogether are stamped with their unmistakable seal of working class. Perhaps the strangest thing of all is this. In a city of 2 million people, there are no hotels. That means, of course, that there is no visitors. The language used to describe the slums of the East End and those who inhabit them also often drew on the vocabulary of imperial exploration. As you will recall from the Unit Britain and Empire, 1839 to 1886, Unit 15 in Block 3, the British Empire expanded enormously in the 19th century. The East End, much like Britain's colonies, was often seen as a foreign or mysterious land and its inhabitants, like many of Britain's imperial subjects, were viewed as a race apart. May use, for example, to describe the London poor as wandering tribes, and observe that when passing from the west to the east of the city, the moral and intellectual change is so great that it seems as if we were in a new land and among another race, quoted in Driver, page 182. Later in this century, the journalist George Sims, 1847 to 1922, described his work, How the Poor Live, 1883, as a book of travel in this work. Sims portrayed the East End as a dark continent and noted that the wild races who inhabit it will, I trust, gain public sympathy as easy as those savage tribes for whose benefit missionary societies never cease to appeal for public sympathy, quoted in Driver 2001, page 181. Drawing on this tradition of urban exploration and sensational journalism, William Booth, 1829 to 1912, the founder of the Salvation Army, titled his treatise on the urban poor in the darkest England and a way out, 1890. Directly echoing the title of the work by the explorer Henry M. Stanley, 1841-1904, in Darkest Africa, 1890. Booth's in Darkest England provided a detailed account of the poverty in East London and proposed a radical scheme for social regeneration. This to improve Booth was drawing on the language of imperialism. In Unit 19, you'll learn more about the Salvation Army and the role that it played in working class culture during the period 1880-1914. Whilst we read 18.2, William Booth extracted the Darkest England and Away Out 1890, located in the unit. In this extract, Booth explains why he has chosen to mimic the title of Stanley's In Darkest Africa. In Booth's eyes, in what ways are the urban slum dwellers similar to the African people? In what ways, according to Booth, are the urban slums similar to the forest of the African interior? As many Victorian accounts of foreign peoples depict Africans in a derogatory manner, portraying them as essentially different from educated British people. He divides them into two categories: the human baboon and the handsome dwarf, whereas the former is vicious and lazy. The latter is a toiling slave, according to Booth. The urban poor who inhabited the slums of British cities are very similar in that they share the savage and simple characteristics of extra European peoples. Moreover, just as Sandy portrays the forests of equatorial Africa as dense, impenetrable, and riddled with disease, so too in Booth's eyes are the urban slums. Booth's account clearly shows how the language of imperialism, which portrayed colonial peoples as savage, inferior beings, and presented colonial lands as vast, mysterious landscapes, had come also to frame the anxieties surrounding the urban environment. Although Booth had a clear sympathy for the plight of the poor, and although he worked hard to alleviate the impact of poverty in London's East End, he also drew on a language that depicted the poor as a race apart. Part of his motivation for doing so was to raise money for charity. If people were willing to donate money to missionary causes abroad, should they not also try to support the poor at home? George Sims, as you have seen, had made a similar analogy. In contrast to these emotional appeals to city, more scientific approaches to understand the city would to some extent depart from the sensational language used by the likes of Mayhew, Sims, and Booth. You explore these approaches in more detail in section 18.4. New forms of social mixing. Despite fears of division, the late Victorian city offered new opportunities for social mixing, which allowed Londoners to transcend the supposed boundaries between the east and the west of the city. Industrial unrest, triggered by the economic downturn of the 1880s, encouraged workers to stage huge demonstrations and marches that led from the East End into the financial and administrative districts of the capital. In 1886 and 1887, large demonstrations were staged in Trafalgar Square by a range of trade unions demanding improved rights and wages. These demonstrations made the poverty of the East End visible to the wealthy inhabitants of the West End and fueled fears among elites that a poverty stricken underclass might rise up and precipitate the downfall of society. You'll learn more about the rise of trade union movement in Unit 19 and in the unit political ferment. By the 1800s, the Metro Police also provide opportunities for people to adopt distinct identities and engage in new activities. In doing so, they challenged and transcended the traditional class and gender boundaries that had previously ordered the urban environment. The mixing of large numbers of people from varying walks of life and the increased anonymity afforded by the big city meant that outward appearances and styles of dresses become increasingly important methods through which people attempt to claim a higher social status. As Simon Gunn has noted, these forms of social mixing and the importance of outward appearances were not entirely a new phenomena. They had been a characteristic feature of the 18th century London, for example, but as the population of cities expanded, and new forms of department stores and new forms of leisure, such as music hall, began to appeal to a broader cross section of the public, facilitating new forms of social mixing in the process. These opportunities also gave rise to new social types, urban characters, who become identified by their style of dress, the districts they move within, and the leisure they pursued. These new social types often challenged and traditional class distinctions that defended Victorian society. Among these figures, for example, were the gents and swells, men from marginal social positions such as clerks and other low status white collar workers who mimicked gentlemanly style of dress. This became easier from the 1860s onwards, with the increased availability of cheap, off the peg suits, and the gents and the swells become recognisable characters and often sources of ridicule. in pages of periodicals and on the stages of music hall. As the historian Judith Walkowitz, 1992, has demonstrated, women also began to move around the city more freely, shopping or working in the West End stores, performing in and attending music halls, or working behind the bar in pubs. This was not always straightforward for women, and appearances and styles of dress were important in determining whether a woman was seen as respectable or whether she might be viewed as a prostitute. This was particularly the case in the West End, around areas such as Regent Street, which were frequented by both prostitutes and female shoppers, resulting in tension and sometimes victims of sexual harassment. When exploring these areas of the city unaccompanied, among the middle classes, this served to fuel anxieties that the modern metropolis was a hotbed of vice that threatened traditional standards of morality. These words of Helena Swanwick, which reflect on her middle class upbringing during the 1800s, reveal how such anxieties influenced her mother's approach to parenting. My mother had said that I could not go into town alone because I might be spoken to by some man. I replied that I had already been spoken to and had already been very angry with the fool, but I could not see that it had done me any harm. She then said a girl as young as I would be taken for a bad woman if she went about Piccadilly or Oxford Street unoccupied. Despite the restrictions placed on middle class women, it is clear that many did live public lives, taking advantage of social opportunities that the Victorian city could offer. While potentially dangerous, the city was also an exciting place. Moreover, while historians such as Walkowitz have focused on London and its plethora of entertainments, it is clear that other big cities in Britain also provided ample leisure activities for women. Eleanor Gordon and Gwyneth Nair's study of the women in Victorian Glasgow, for example, reveals that middle class women were far from confined to home and hearth. Attending highbrow events such as concerts, balls at the theatre, alongside more popular forms of entertainment such as pantomimes, circuses, and ice shows. Gordon and Nair, 2003. Crime and scandal in the 1880s. As you have seen, a range of anxieties concerning sexual danger, prostitution, extreme poverty, and social disorder all come to be associated with the city, and especially London, towards the end of the 19th century. During the 1880s, these anxieties were brought to the fore, sparking public outrage in the wake of a number of shocking criminal investigations, the most famous of which concerned the Jack the Ripper murders in 1888. Jack the Ripper murders, however, were not the first case of criminality in London to attract intense media scrutiny during the 1880s. In July 1885, W.T. Stead, 1849 to 1912, a pioneering investigative journalist, wrote a series of articles entitled Urbanisation, which examined the effects of criminality in London. And a march on Hyde Park, which forced the government to pass the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885. One of the primary provisions of this act, which aimed to clamp down on vice and prostitution, was the raising of the age of consent from 13 to 16 years old. For of the vice, while seeming to be a world apart, actually existed